The night my daughter called me crying from a frozen front porch, I was inside a flooded utility room nearly 70 miles away, trying to stop water from pouring through the ceiling of a building my company serviced. "Dad, please come get me." Her voice was breaking apart between the wind and her breathing. "Where are you?" "Outside Grandma's house." I stopped moving. It was Christmas Eve, 21 degrees. My 17-year-old daughter was standing in the snow, wearing nothing but a thin red sweater because her grandfather had thrown her out for defending me, and her mother had let him. I was standing ankle-deep in freezing water, 90 minutes away, while more than 30 members of my wife's family sat inside a warm house eating dinner and pretending my daughter wasn't shivering a few feet from them. They believed I was a broke maintenance supervisor. They believed I drove an old truck because I couldn't afford anything better. They believed my wife was finally about to leave the loser she had married. What none of them knew was that I owned the company that employed nearly half of them. And by the end of that night, the secret I had protected for 8 years was going to destroy everything they thought they controlled. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Ethan Mercer. I'm 43 years old, and I founded Mercer Property Services in 2012 with $22,000, one used work van, and a contractor's license I had earned the year before my daughter was born. By 2023, the company had 52 full-time employees, 4 regional managers, and annual revenue just under $18 million. We handled residential and commercial maintenance contracts across 6 counties. We were large enough to manage apartment complexes, office buildings, shopping centers, and private developments, but still small enough that I knew most of my employees by name. I was proud of what I had built, though I rarely talked about it. My wife, Natalie, was proud of different things. She was proud of her family name. The Bennett family wasn't actually wealthy, but they had spent decades perfecting the appearance of wealth. They lived in a large colonial house in Westbrook, belonged to the right church, hosted elaborate holiday dinners, and talked about standards more than anyone I had ever met. Natalie's father, Richard Bennett, had spent almost 30 years as a senior manager at a regional insurance company. He had a decent salary, a polished wardrobe, and a deep belief that a man's value could be measured by his job title, his neighborhood, and the condition of his shoes. Richard used the word class the way religious people use the word faith. Constantly, seriously, and usually while explaining why someone else didn't have enough of it. The first time Natalie brought me to meet her family, I wore jeans, work boots, and a clean gray shirt. I drove a 12-year-old Chevrolet Silverado with a dent near the rear bumper. Richard looked at me slowly from my boots to my hands. "So, you're a handyman." It wasn't a question. "Operations supervisor," Natalie said before I could answer. That was the first lie. It came out so naturally that for a moment I almost didn't recognize it as one. At the time, I didn't challenge her. I was 35, completely in love, and convinced that any problem could be solved if 2 people cared enough about each other. Natalie laughed at my jokes. She never complained about my calloused hands. She said she admired that I had built my career from nothing. 8 months later, we were married. The Bennetts arrived at the wedding in coordinated formal clothes, as though they were attending a family portrait session. I wore a navy blazer that Richard complimented 3 times in a way that somehow felt like an insult. A week after the wedding, Natalie sat beside me at the kitchen table and held both of my hands. "My family is proud," she said. "They won't understand the business. They'll think you're exaggerating or trying to impress them. Just let them believe you're a supervisor. It'll keep the peace." I should have asked how long she expected that arrangement to last. Instead, I nodded. I told myself it didn't matter what her family thought. I knew who I was. Natalie knew who I was. That should have been enough. For 8 years, I let them believe I worked for someone else. 8 years of holiday dinners, birthday parties, graduations, weddings, and Sunday lunches. 8 years of Richard making jokes about my truck. 8 years of Natalie's mother, Diane, recommending better clothing stores because, as she once told me, a man in your position should still try to look presentable. 8 years of smiling, passing the food, and pretending none of it bothered me. Richard called my work glorified plumbing. He once asked whether I had ever considered getting a real management position. He said it while wearing a watch that cost less than the profit my company made during an average week. I never corrected him. The silence became more complicated when Natalie started asking me to hire members of her family. First, her older brother, Jason. He had lost his job after arguing with a supervisor and needed something quickly. Natalie asked whether I could find him a position. I hired him as a procurement coordinator at $76,000 a year. Then came her cousin Brandon. Then Richard's nephew Kyle. Then two more cousins, an uncle and a family friend named Owen, whom Richard described as one of the most reliable men you'll ever meet. Over the years, the number kept growing. By the time I finally searched the company directory for Bennett family connections, 43 names appeared. Not all of them were related by blood. Some were spouses, friends, godchildren, or people Richard had personally recommended. Many were good employees. Some were not. I avoided examining the pattern too closely because Natalie always made the same argument. They need work. You need people. Why turn it into something ugly? So I didn't. I let Richard sit across from me at Christmas dinners and mock the same company that was paying his children's mortgages. I let Diane slip me an envelope containing money for a proper suit before Easter service. I handed it back unopened and thanked her for thinking of me. That might have been the most humiliating part. Not what they said, the fact that I kept accepting it. I called it patience. I called it protecting my marriage. I told myself I was choosing peace. The truth was that I had slowly allowed Natalie's comfort to become more important than my dignity. Then Christmas Eve arrived. At 7:35 that evening, a main pipe burst at Brighton Commerce Center, a 68-unit property my company had maintained for 5 years. The on-call technician, Miguel Santos, arrived first. He assessed the damage, shut off the nearest valve, and called me because the break was inside an older section of the main line. The repair required either a temporary bypass or shutting down water to the entire east wing. I called Natalie. She was already at her parents' house with our daughter Chloe. "I'm going to be late," I said. "Probably 2 hours." She sighed. "You promised you would be here tonight?" "A main line burst. I can't leave the building without water." "Fine, Ethan. We'll see you whenever you decide to show up." Then she ended the call. I drove to Brighton, climbed into the service space, and started helping Miguel with the repair. At 9:18, my phone rang. I almost ignored it because both of my hands were covered in grime and freezing water. Then I saw Chloe's name. I answered immediately. "Dad?" The wind behind her voice was so loud that I could barely hear her. "What happened?" "Please come get me." I stood up too fast and struck my shoulder against a metal support. "Where are you?" "On the front porch." "Why are you outside?" She tried to answer, but her breathing kept catching. "Grandpa was making fun of your truck again. He said you were too lazy to buy something that didn't look like junk." Everybody laughed. I closed my eyes. "And I told him to stop. I said you work harder than anyone in that room and that he didn't know anything about you." Her voice dropped. He got angry. He said I was disrespecting him in his house. Then he opened the door and told me I could stand outside until I was ready to apologize. My grip tightened around the phone. "Where's your coat?" "Inside." "How long have you been out there?" "I don't know. Maybe 20 minutes. "Where is your mother?" She didn't answer. That silence lasted only a few seconds, but it told me everything. "Chloe, where is Mom?" She said I should apologize so I wouldn't ruin Christmas. I was already climbing out of the service space. "Listen to me. Go near the side wall where the wind isn't as strong. Keep moving your fingers. I'm leaving now." "Dad, you're far away." "I'm coming." I turned to Miguel, told him to call our emergency backup supervisor, and ran to my truck. The drive should have taken an hour and 20 minutes. I made it in 57. I remember very little about the road. I remember the temperature display dropping from 21 to 19 degrees. I remember calling Chloe every 10 minutes and making her stay on the phone. I remember the anger inside me becoming quieter with every mile. It wasn't explosive. It was cold. The kind of anger that doesn't want to scream. The kind that starts making decisions. When I pulled into the Bennett's driveway, Chloe was standing at the far end of the porch with her arms wrapped around her body. Her backpack sat near her feet. Through the front window, I could see the Christmas tree, the dining room lights, people moving between tables, drinks in their hands. Richard was standing near the fireplace, laughing. Natalie was beside the kitchen entrance, holding a champagne glass. She had not come outside once. I got out of the truck and ran to Chloe. The moment she saw me, she started crying harder. I took off my coat, wrapped it around her, and pulled her against me. She was shaking so badly that I could feel it through both our clothes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "You have nothing to apologize for." "I made everything worse." "No," I said. "You made it honest. I held her until her breathing slowed. Then I walked toward the front door. I didn't knock. I kicked it open. The door slammed against the inside wall with a crack loud enough to stop every conversation in the house. Music continued playing for another second before someone turned it off. More than 30 people stared at me. Richard stood near the fireplace with a glass in one hand. For the first time since I had met him, he looked uncertain. I saw Chloe's coat hanging over the back of a chair near the entrance. I picked it up and turned to take it outside. That was when Natalie stepped in front of me. She was holding a thick envelope. Her expression was calm. Too calm. She pushed the envelope against my chest. "You've embarrassed this family long enough," she said. "These are divorce papers. I want you out of the house by tomorrow." Behind her, Richard smiled. It was not a surprised smile. It was the expression of a man who had been waiting to see this happen. "Best Christmas gift she ever gave herself," he said. Then he looked past me toward the porch. "Tell your father to put gas in that piece of junk before it breaks down on the way home." Someone laughed. Then another person did. I looked around the room, at Natalie, at Richard, at Jason, Brandon, Kyle, and every other person whose paycheck had passed through a company account carrying my signature. Some of them looked uncomfortable. Others looked amused. They believed they had just thrown a broke maintenance worker out of their family. I tucked the divorce papers under my arm. "You're right, Natalie," I said. "It is time." Then I walked out. Chloe climbed into the passenger seat without looking back at the house. Neither of us spoke for the first 15 minutes. The heater was running at full blast, but she still sat curled against the door with my coat wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Snow drifted across the empty highway in long white ribbons. Finally, she whispered, "Dad." "Yeah?" I shouldn't have argued with Grandpa. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. "No, you should never apologize for defending someone you love." She stared through the windshield. "I just didn't want them talking about you like that anymore." I swallowed hard. "They've been talking about me for years," I said quietly. "Tonight, they just made one mistake too many." She fell asleep before we reached the hotel. I booked 2 rooms online while waiting at a traffic light, then changed my mind and reserved 1 room with 2 beds. I wasn't letting her out of my sight that night. After I carried our bags upstairs, she barely touched the food I ordered. Within minutes, she was asleep. I couldn't. The divorce papers were lying across the desk. Unlike the performance at the Bennett house, those papers were professionally prepared. Natalie hadn't made an emotional decision. She had made a business decision. Everything was organized. Property requests, financial disclosures, temporary support, a complete plan. What caught my attention wasn't what was included. It was what wasn't. According to the filing, my primary income came from a salaried management position at an unnamed property maintenance company. No mention of ownership. No mention of Mercer Property Services. No mention of the business itself. Either Natalie still believed I simply worked there, or she knew exactly what she was doing. At 11:30 that night, I opened my laptop. I logged into the company's internal system. Then I searched one word. Bennett. 43 employee records appeared. For the first time in years, I stopped looking away. I started reviewing every file. Not because I wanted revenge, because I suddenly realized something. For 8 years, I had ignored every possible conflict of interest simply because I wanted peace at home. That mistake ended tonight. Our compliance software had already collected years of payroll records, fuel reports, purchasing logs, and expense claims. Normally, internal audits were routine. This one wasn't. I set the search to review every employee connected to the Bennett family during the previous 3 years. While the system worked, I made terrible hotel coffee and sat in silence. Just before 2 in the morning, the report finished. I read every page. Some files were completely clean. Some weren't. Jason Bennett had been approving company fuel purchases that never reached company vehicles. The discrepancies weren't enormous individually, but over time they added up to more than $30,000. Kyle Bennett had approved duplicate vendor payments through outside accounts that should never have existed. Several expense reports connected to family outings had somehow become business entertainment. The pattern wasn't everywhere, but it existed. By sunrise, I had identified 13 employee files requiring formal investigation. The remaining Bennett relatives had clean records. I separated them immediately. I refused to punish innocent people simply because they shared the same last name. At 3:40 that morning, I called my attorney. Michael Grant had represented my companies for almost 10 years. He answered before the 4th ring. I told him everything. The hidden ownership. 8 years of lies. The divorce papers. My daughter standing outside in freezing weather. The audit. He didn't interrupt me once. When I finished, he was silent for several seconds. Then he said exactly what I needed to hear. We handle this legally. Over the next hour, we built a plan. First, every questionable financial record would be preserved and reviewed by independent forensic accountants. Second, employees with documented misconduct would receive formal termination notices only after the evidence had been verified. Third, every action would go through legal channels. No public revenge, no social media, no emotional decisions. Justice lasts longer than anger, Michael said. I'd like both, I admitted. You'll probably get both, he replied, but only if you stay disciplined. I slept less than 3 hours. By Wednesday morning, I was sitting in my office wearing the navy suit I usually saved for investor meetings. At exactly 9 o'clock, HR began delivering termination letters supported by documented violations. 5 minutes later, my phone rang. Richard Bennett, I answered. Ethan, he said sharply. Some idiot in your HR department fired half my family this morning. I need the number of whoever's in charge before I drive over there. I let the silence stretch. You already have it, I said. What? I'm the person in charge. Another silence. Longer this time. Mercer Property Services, I continued. Mercer, as in Ethan Mercer, founder, sole owner, chief executive officer. He didn't speak. The internal audit found serious financial misconduct involving several employees connected to your family. Those cases are now being handled through legal counsel. That's impossible. No, it's documented. Ethan? My attorney has also sent Natalie formal notice regarding the house. What house? The one she told me to leave. I looked through the glass wall of my office at employees beginning another workday. The property belongs to one of my companies. Richard's breathing became uneven. I didn't know. No, I answered. You never bothered to find out. Then I ended the call. Within minutes, my phone exploded with messages. Calls, texts, voicemails, relatives, friends, people who hadn't spoken to me in years suddenly wanted to explain everything. I turned the phone face down on my desk. For the first time in a very long time, I finally had nothing left to hide. I thought the worst part was over. I was wrong. At 7:02 that evening, after ignoring dozens of calls, I noticed one text message that had arrived hours earlier from a number I didn't recognize. We need to talk. I know what Natalie did before she served you the divorce papers. All of it. I stared at the screen. It could have been a prank. Someone trying to insert themselves into a family disaster, or it could be the one piece I was still missing. Instead of replying, I forwarded the message to Michael. He called me less than 10 minutes later. Do you know the number? No. Give me an hour. 43 minutes later, he called back. The message came from Laura Mitchell. Who is she? She worked as a paralegal at the law firm that prepared your divorce papers. She resigned less than 2 weeks ago. I called her immediately. She answered before the second ring. Mr. Mercer? Yes. I've been hoping you'd call. Her voice sounded exhausted and not frightened, just tired. I need you to understand something, she said. I'm not asking for money and I don't want anything from you. I left because I was asked to do something I couldn't justify. What happened? She took a slow breath. Your wife didn't start planning this divorce a few months ago. My stomach tightened. How long? Almost 15 months. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Laura continued. She came to the firm over a year ago. She already knew exactly what your company was worth. She brought financial records, public filings, property information, everything. I closed my office door. She knew? Yes. All of it? Yes. The room suddenly felt very quiet. For 15 months, Laura continued, she worked with the attorneys on the best way to make it appear that you were simply a salaried employee instead of the owner. I didn't interrupt. If the business looked like someone else's company during the early stages of the divorce, the financial disclosure process could have taken months. During that time, she intended to negotiate temporary support using a much lower income figure. She knew I owned everything. She absolutely knew. I leaned back in my chair. The lie hadn't been for her parents. It had been for the courtroom. Laura hesitated before continuing. There was something else. Go on. She was asked to sign paperwork that described the ownership structure in a way I believed was misleading. I refused. And then I resigned. She had spent nearly 2 weeks deciding whether she owed a complete stranger the truth. In the end, she decided she did. Within an hour, Michael had arranged a meeting between Laura and the forensic accounting team reviewing our financial records. 3 days later, another report landed on my desk. This one had nothing to do with company employees. It was about Natalie. Over the previous 18 months, she had quietly transferred more than $300,000 from our joint savings into accounts opened under her maiden name. The transfers had been broken into smaller amounts, spread across dozens of transactions, labeled as household expenses, investment deposits, home improvements, anything that wouldn't immediately attract attention. Individually, they looked ordinary. Together, they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. The forensic accountant summarized it in one sentence. The transaction history indicates deliberate concealment of marital assets in anticipation of divorce proceedings. Michael smiled for the first time in days. That sentence, he said, just changed this entire case. Everything was filed with the court. Laura signed a sworn affidavit. The forensic report was attached. The financial audit was attached. Less than 72 hours later, Natalie's original attorney withdrew from representing her. She hired another lawyer almost immediately. Unlike the first one, the new attorney didn't try to intimidate us. She called Michael herself. My client would like to discuss a settlement. That wasn't the victory. The victory had happened much earlier. It happened the moment Chloe realized she would never have to spend another Christmas in that house. Jason and Kyle eventually faced criminal investigations connected to the company audit. The remaining employees who had done nothing wrong received generous severance packages, excellent references, and personal recommendations from me. Several found new jobs within weeks. They weren't collateral damage. They were decent people who happened to belong to the wrong family. I wasn't going to punish them for someone else's choices. The divorce was finalized in early spring. Natalie received exactly what the law said she deserved, not what she had spent more than a year trying to engineer. She moved back into her parents' house. Ironically, the same house where they once laughed at the man they believed had nothing. Chloe came to live with me. One afternoon, while unpacking boxes in her new room, she held up a framed family picture. Should I keep this? I looked at it for a long moment. That depends. On what? Whether it reminds you of people who loved you or people you had to survive. She studied the picture quietly. Then she placed it back in the box. I think I'm okay without it. For the first time since Christmas Eve, I believed we both were. About 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized, I received one last call from Richard. I almost ignored it. Instead, I let it go to voicemail. That evening, after Chloe had gone upstairs to finish her homework, I sat alone in the kitchen and listened to it. For the first time since I'd known him, Richard sounded old. Not physically, emotionally, like someone who had finally run out of certainty. Ethan, he began quietly, I know you probably don't want to hear from me. A long pause. I've spent a lot of time thinking. Another pause. I didn't know. He stopped again before continuing. I didn't know who you really were. He apologized for the jokes, for the truck, for the comments, for what happened to Chloe, for Christmas Eve, for everything. When the message ended, I didn't feel satisfaction. I didn't feel anger. Mostly, I felt tired, because the more I thought about his apology, the more one sentence stayed with me. I didn't know who you really were. That wasn't an apology. It was an explanation. He believed he had treated me badly because he thought I was an ordinary working man. But that had never been the real problem. The problem was much simpler. He believed ordinary working people deserved to be treated that way. If I truly had been nothing more than the maintenance supervisor he imagined, everything he did would still have been wrong. The money didn't change my value. It only changed who suffered the consequences. I never returned the call. Not because I hated him, because there was nothing left to say. Several months passed. Life became surprisingly quiet. Chloe finished her junior year with excellent grades and started working part-time for a local landscaping company during weekends. I offered her a position at Mercer Property Services. She smiled and shook her head. I want to earn it somewhere else first. I couldn't have been more proud. Every Tuesday and Thursday we had dinner together, even after she got busy with school and work. Sometimes we talked for hours. Sometimes we sat in comfortable silence. Either way, it felt more like family than anything we'd experienced during the previous 8 years. The company had its strongest first quarter since it opened. New commercial contracts pushed our projected annual revenue higher than ever before. Several employees earned promotions they had deserved for years. Watching good people succeed turned out to be far more satisfying than watching dishonest people fail. One afternoon, I drove my old Silverado to meet the owner of a large property management group. The truck still had the dent near the rear bumper. I had never repaired it. As I climbed out, the owner looked at the truck, smiled, and said, "Looks like she's been working for a long time." "She has," I answered, "but she still gets the job done." He laughed. We walked inside. 2 hours later, we signed one of the biggest contracts in company history. On the drive home, I rolled the windows down despite the cool air. For years, I had worried about what people thought when they saw that truck. Now, I realized the people worth respecting had never cared. The dent was still there. So were the worn work boots in the back seat. The only thing that had really changed was me.